Welcome, everybody. My name is Carrie Bingen. I'm the director of the Aerospace Security Project here at the Center for Strategic and International Studies. I'd like to welcome you to the launch of our report, the 2024 Commercial Remote Sensing Global Rankings. You expected to see Dr. Hamry here. He sends his regrets. He's a bit under the weather, but I have an opportunity here to kick us off today. At CSIS, we have been focused on strategic competition with China. We released a series earlier this year, A World Dividing, examining the most critical questions facing US-China relations: how to deter Chinese military activity and counter economic coercion, how to outcompete China in the technology race, and how to enhance US geopolitical standing. Space, and in particular commercial remote sensing, is one dimension of this competition that has technology, security, and economic components. We are seeing the benefit of commercial satellites, from bringing transparency to the battlefield in Ukraine, to monitoring crops, maritime activities, and natural disasters. This was an opportunity to bring together 4 independent, not-for-profit institutions that specialize in international security, space, and geospatial sciences and innovation to consider the strategic importance of US leadership in commercial remote sensing. I'd like to thank the Taylor Geospatial Institute, the Taylor Geospatial Engine, and the United States Geospatial Intelligence Foundation for their collaboration and support of this project. The stakes are high, and the results may be surprising. So let's celebrate the advances by US companies that we'll see in the report discussed in just a bit. But I also expect that the results of the report and the policy discussion contained therein will spur important policy conversations about US leadership, the state of global competition, and how to keep the US private sector at the leading edge of innovation and atop the global marketplace. To kick us off, I would like to introduce Sue Gordon, a dear friend of mine, of CSIS, and all of the institutions represented here with this project. Her service to the nation spans over 3 decades. The 5th Principal Deputy Director of National Intelligence, the former Deputy Director of NGA. She has served in a variety of leadership positions at CIA, and she's a plank holder at InQtel. She now continues her service and her thought leadership in a variety of different boards, including the Defense Innovation Board. She continues to mentor so many in and out of our community, whether you're senior or junior, she's there at the other end of the phone. On a personal note, when I was in the Pentagon, I could not have asked for a better partner and leader of the intelligence community and the intelligence enterprise. She tackled some incredibly tough, complex issues, and I always appreciated the candor that she brought, the foresight, the pragmatism. She would roll up her sleeves and do the work that needed to be necessary. I also appreciated her humor. This was a tough time, and just having a bit of humor too was incredibly helpful. She's an inspiring and visionary leader, innovative, thought-provoking, and that's what she'll do for us today. I think anyone that's been in a room with her, you leave that conversation feeling hopeful, but also feeling challenged and motivated. So I think today, she'll leave us with all those pieces: hopeful, challenged, and motivated to tackle these issues. So without further ado, let me please welcome Sue Gordon to the stage.
Well, thanks, Carrie. I clearly need to do a little bit more mentoring because I very specifically said keep your introduction short. Actually, in preparing for this talk and knowing that, in fact, it's conceivable, Carrie, that I will be provocative, and because I've been out of the government game for a bit, I thought I need to reestablish my bona fides. So you won't believe this, but I was actually made to talk on this topic. So when was Sputnik launched? Anyone know? 57. October, in fact, in 1957. When was Sue Gordon born? 9 months later. Exactly, in July of 58. Like, my parents looked at my brother and sister and said, nah, there won't be enough. Let's get Sue in the game. 1960, Corona was launched, right? So we have the national security community with its need to be able to see beyond the horizon really take its advance. And in its very first launch, it collected more images than all the U-2 missions had collected. In 1969, it's my 11th birthday. On the 21st of July, one day after they walked on the moon. In 1970, China became the 4th country to launch a satellite. Shocking, given how long it took them to be a real player and how short it has taken them to achieve the position that this report articulates. 72 is Landsat. We see the commercial industry come in. We understand how much space can support, the understanding of human activities. 1982, interestingly enough, were the launch of Cosmos 1366 and Cosmos 1426. I was a young telemetry analyst at the CIA, and I noticed that 1366, a communications satellite, was doing weird pointing and was pointing at Cosmos 1426. It was the Soviets' first near real-time imager. In 1988, a very young intelligence officer went with Jim Fletcher, the director of NASA, to give a briefing to Ronald Reagan in the sit room on the Soviet civilian space program. And in that conversation, the conclusion was, you know, look at that incredible launch industry they have. We ought to consider partnering with Russia for commercial space launches. In 1996, I was up on the 6th floor of the CIA when John Deutsch decided he was going to give INPEC its freedom, and NEMA was born. And I fought against it tooth and nail, because how could they take away from the intelligence community that national treasure? And look what happened when they did, and all the things that have issued forth. 2015, I get to join NGA. I hadn't thought about geospatial intelligence until I met with Robert Cardillo, and I learned to love the idea of succeeding in the open and with the open. In 2015, I also saw Will Marshall's 2014 TED Talk, and it inspired me. This idea, here's what I took away from it. Imagine what you could do if you could image the skin of the earth every single day, and I could imagine. I fell in love with the potential of commercial. And then in 2020, I get the opportunity to join the board of a commercial satellite company. So for me, if you take all of that, one, I'm fulfilling my parents' destiny that they imagined for me, that I get to play space my whole career, but more importantly, I get to talk in front of you about this moment we have. I'm so happy to be here, Carrie, with you. Everything you said about me was actually stealing from my notes here. You were the best partner ever. More importantly, the combination of CSIS and USGIF and Taylor, both the Institute and the engine, is really incredibly important. I think what this study represents, and I'm going to spend no time talking about it, I'm going to say it's super important. Because what it does is it presents an incontrovertible, simple, not simplistic, simple picture of the situation that exists, and it demonstrates in the most straightforward fashion the reality of the moment, the challenge for national security, the opportunity for advance, and the work still to be done. Amazing piece of work, and I'll talk a little bit more about what I'll challenge you at the end to what I think you ought to do about this. So I have 4 thoughts for today, and I'll kind of walk through them in some slow walk as I see fit. The first is, let's talk about the moment in which we find ourselves. We have one in so many dimensions. We have one in space, too. And that is an area that has been disproportionately a national advantage for my whole life is now at least at parity and potentially we're not succeeding on every front. It is also a moment where there are so many unanswered questions from a security standpoint, unanswered questions from a societal standpoint, all of which can go through what is happening both in the security space and the commercial space. It is hard not to look at this moment and say, oh my gosh, we have all the raw materials we need in order to be able to do anything that we want. That promise that national security always has about taking the idea of deep pockets, long time horizons, and big problems, turning it into advance that then delivers on its promise by letting those advances free into society in order to lift even more. If you go back to the story, the chronology I told you, that's in fact what has happened with the national security investment, and the commercial sector has made good on it. Good beyond security, good with security, and something that pushes national security to where it could be. Our adversaries and competitors are advancing. I think one of the most disappointing things to me societally is that we seem to still be living this notion of abundance and ease. I thought the pandemic would wake us up that this is a contested world, that there are those who need more who will try and get it at our expense. The Space Force was formed in some of that contestation, but I'm just going to tell you it is bigger than that. And some of those answers we need can be found by getting distance. One of the best quotations I heard from an astronaut, I can't remember who it was that said it, and that is, when you go to space, you know more because you see better. We have done that. Look at what exists. Look at what you've built. Whether you are on the government side or on the commercial side, look at what exists. And that's amazing. And the last piece about the moment I'm going to share you is every impediment we have to getting to any place we want to go, anything you can imagine doing. I use NGA as an example all the time. Man, safety of nav, our most iconic mission, descendant of the Titanic, the combination of national security assets and commercial assets, I don't have to have updates every 28 days. I can do it now, and now, and now, and now, and now, if we think about how to do it. So the most important thing about this moment is that there isn't any miracle required for us to look at what we need, look at what we have, and figure out a way to put it together to get things done. So, moment. Here's another thing I know. Anyone who doesn't take a moment has doomed their successors to a 20-year delay. If the people in position now don't make the decisions that they can, we are handing off not a one-for-one delay, but a budgetary cycle delay, a decision delay in terms of how it comes. So you either step into a moment or you don't. And here, I'm here to tell you, and Carrie, that's what this study shows. This is a moment. So that's one. Number two, space is and always has been important to national security. For all the reasons I said. But being a passive stander by, and expecting market forces alone to drive the advance just isn't going to be good enough. Big problems, deep pockets, long time horizons, all of those are super important. The advantages that have come from national security caring about technology, knowing what needs to be done, are replete over time. I could be doing an AI conference and make the same point, that AI and national security have got to partner together. But this is so close. It's just sitting there for us to be done that we must. And we see the benefits when we do play, and we're seeing the consequence when we don't bring those two communities together. It's as though we think everyone looking at the same future will make the same decisions, and we are worried about crossing some imaginary streams that will break some rule of a bygone era. My analogy is in the cyber world. Our adversaries and competitors have figured out how to cross the boundaries we believe in. They figured out how to go and steal secrets from companies that the government doesn't go into. They figured out how to go to state and local elections because the federal government doesn't work there. And that community is figuring out how to share information in a way that brings those two things together. I think this is one where we can. NASA, actually, I think has done has a model of engagement with the commercial sector that the national security community could emulate. Where instead of just hoping that the commercial sector figures out what you need and delivers something that's going to be useful, although you're going to judge it harshly when it isn't quite perfect, and therefore that will be a reason that you don't adopt it, NASA actually will put out its mission needs and do some weird funding of competitions in the commercial sector in order to do it. I think there are some models. And if you want to know why I think the national security community can use NASA as a model, tooting my own horn a little bit, in the summer of 1998, when George Tenet needed something cool in his strategic plan, and he gave this GS-15 the challenge to come up with a way to get to Silicon Valley, and I came up with the idea that became InQtel. Do you know what legal authority we used? This little known thing called OTA that only NASA was using at the time. You imagine how much I laugh when I see, hey, we have this new thing called OTA that we can use now. But I'm telling you, there are models out there that we can use to bring our communities together. So one, it's a moment, we got to leap into it. Hey, Ed Morton, what a great day for me. So there's a moment. National security has to be involved. It can't just sit by. And here's the other thing about it. That chart, what I know about the energy that's in the commercial sector, what I know about the money that is designed to use, what I know about the commercial needs that are going to pull, if the national security community doesn't involve itself in what's going on in the commercial sector, it will go blowing by. And it will be thin gruel compared to what it will be if we partner. And I don't want to talk about your scoring methodology, but given that we know that China is willing to fight unfairly, and they already have the ability to do some things, do we really want to create disadvantage at exactly the moment that we need an advantage? So number 3, love the study, love all the capabilities. In 2024, it's a world where every technology is available to everyone. In other words, capability is not the advantage that it once was. My national security community depended on capability advantage. We were so much better technically that that was enough. 2024 and beyond is the one that can put it to clever use faster. So the challenge we have, even with that display of capability in this study, the challenge we have as a collective of, oh, you wanted to use it. And so for companies, how are you making sure that what you're delivering is usable? Are we thinking about the infrastructure that will allow us to use it if we decided that we wanted to bring a different capability in? And are we thinking more about the outcomes we must have rather than the things that we can build? What do we need to be able to do? In my estimation, has to be our watchword, and it will be the reason that you overcome things. Anyone see the movie Hidden Figures? Okay, it was both inspiring and depressing for me. That was my community, and I had no idea that those women put us on the moon. Now let's think about this. In the 1950s, how is it possible that black women were the ones that put us on the moon? And the answer is we needed to get to the moon. And so we looked around at what we had and I said, well, I guess we better use it. If you think about what we must be able to do, rather than what we must be able to build or have, you will have the impetus to do things differently. It's the only way. You'll have the impetus to talk to Congress about the money you need because we need to be able to do X by Y time, and that takes this much. So usability, but we're not very usable yet. You haven't yet, this study did not yet look at usability, and there are really interesting things not on those pages that are advances on that, but it's not enough for the moment. And the last one is opportunities, and this is my favorite thing to talk about, is to give you advice, because I'm old. Here are my piece of advice. Number one, partnership in all varieties is going to make a difference. It's going to make a difference in terms of national partnerships with allies and partners. If we don't do it, we now know through Ukraine that those countries will acquire this capability. And they will go to companies to buy it. And those companies will sell it because they must make money. And I think there has to be something more interesting that we can do as a collective. Even if it was the security community deciding that it would be great if we supported a company selling a capability to a nation state, so we didn't have quite the same policy considerations, but we did. So partnership amongst the companies that are right now competitors, right? We know what the government does. The government hates choosing winners. It just does. So can companies do something to make the government not have to choose? Let's be competitive mates. Let's think about the outcome from a company perspective about what they're going to need, and instead of build things in the way we prefer, build things that will service that client and show that they don't always have to choose. Policy, holy smokes. Much like in cyber, we do not have the policy basis for the things that we could do, even in national security or commercially. Our policies are built up over years, and they are almost all designed to keep bad things from happening. I don't know if I have any policymakers in the room, but maybe someone will watch this. I would say, let's start making policies that allow good things to happen. Right? Risk avoidance is awesome. But look at that chart. No matter how much we wanted to have unique advantage, the world turned in a way. So now it's not what I'm keeping from happening that is going to be advantage. It's how fast I can get to what no one else has. And that piece, I'll take us every day, free and open societies every day, and twice on Sundays. And it'd be great, since I mentioned cyber, if we would actually be, in this community, the leaders in terms of cybersecurity from this element of critical infrastructure. It's a distributed thing. Let's make it a competitive advantage. Norms and Standards, there's a great book, Steven Pinker's, Angels of Our Better Nature, and it's an observable that there's less human violence than there's been at any time in history. And that's just because with societies and organization and leadership, we figured out that that wasn't a very successful way to advance. I would argue that in the digital space, I could write a book called The Devil of Our Digital Nature. And if in one situation we're asymptotically approaching 0, and the other we're asymptotically approaching 100. The difference is, are there norms and standards that govern use in those spaces? We as a community can define the norms and standards, and we should do it with our partners that are more on the value base than they are on the implementation, because this is weird. Sovereign nations have different standards. So policy, norms, and standards, speed, holy smokes. If you believe what I said about capability, then advantage is fleeting, and you have to get things into use and get things into use and get things into use, which is why, in fact, you have to go commercial at some point, because that's a way for some class of capabilities to get obsolescent proof, because it just moves along. And the last is just mission sharing. I remember when In-Q-Tel in '98, I was accused of being anti-American because, my gosh, the CIA can't possibly tell what our big problems were. And I'm like, do you think the average bear can't figure out what our big problems are? We need to share mission, and that will help. Okay, Carrie, promise, almost done. I was thinking about all the analogies that I use in all my talks that are really all about getting on with it. We need to get on with this. When you read that report, when you think about your daily lives, when you squint at it, defocus your eyes, you will see that we have everything we need. I want us to quit waiting to be turned over like a duck in an arcade. Is there anyone my age that remembers that? It was the 5-cent ticket. There was a little water trough and there were plastic ducks floating in it. And that was all my parents let me have. And you turn it over and there's a number on the bottom. Let's quit waiting to be turned over. Let's be more active than that. And here's what I know about how you get to the future. You can only get to the future if you let go of something that you have always believed in. We cannot hold on, whether companies or government, to everything that we have always believed to be true. You have to let go of some fixed points, otherwise you are dragging them and you won't get there. We built the U-2 in 11 months. In-Q-Tel was delivered in 7. Ukraine used commercial in a minute to help fend off an invading horde. This domain is designed for that kind of opportunity and speed. So take what this study shows. It's awesome. I had no idea what I would say had I not read it. Do not quibble with it. Don't go backwards. For goodness sake, don't look at it and say, how is my company not a gold medal winner? They may be wrong. That's not important. What it shows is a picture about what will happen if we don't introduce ourselves into the game. And as I said, this is not a world of ease and abundance. Space is the domain that can enable human activities. So use everything you have, every opportunity that we have to create the future that we need. Thanks.
I'd ask for our next panel to come up, and as we get assembled, I said at the outset, we promised inspiring, motivating, and also challenging. So I think Sue has given us a great challenge and a great segue for our next panel to dive in on. So Madeline, I'm going to turn it over to you.
Afternoon. I first have to share kind of a personal moment here because I had the wonder, right, the gift, I'm pointing at you as if you're Sue Gordon, but hang on, to have Sue do what she just did, right, which is inspire, motivate, challenge, which is an amazing way to set the room and to get our minds in the right place. Be up and do, as Sue liked to say. But now I realize too at the same moment, oh my goodness, we have to follow Sue. So we have this challenge, but with this group, I am not worried at all. I'm very pleased, I should reintroduce myself. I'm Robert Cardillo. Oh, I'm sorry, this is not the dress rehearsal. Please go ahead.
No. I did some research, so I can hype you up. It's fine. It's fine. I'll help.
Can you take me anywhere?
No. All right. Thanks, everyone, for coming. Thank you, Robert, for your little intro. Thank you especially to Carrie for her framing remarks and to Sue Gordon, both giants of the national security world and truly inspirational to the younger generation thinking about making a positive impact through policy. I'm Madeline Chang, a Horizon Institute for Public Service Fellow on the CSIS Aerospace Security Project, and one of the co-authors of the report. Before I introduce the first panel, I'd like to give a shout out to the research team that spent weeks tirelessly finding and fact-checking all of the data that went into the commercial remote sensing global rankings. Thea Aldrich, Louis Gleason, Lindsay Hoffman, Nicholas Lee, Philip Toussaint, and Samuel Vogler, many of whom are in person here today. The report also benefited from the leadership and expertise of the speakers on the first panel, who will share insights about the methodology, challenges, and goals of the report. I'm honored to introduce panel moderator Robert Cardillo, founder of the Cardillo Group and former director of the National Geospatial Intelligence Agency. At NGA, he forged innovative partnerships with the growing commercial geospatial marketplace. Over 36 years in public service, Robert also served in leadership positions with the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, the Defense Intelligence Agency, and the Office of the Director of National Intelligence. I'll leave it to him to introduce our fantastic panelists. Thanks again, everyone, and over to you, Robert.
Thanks, okay, we'll reset now, right? I told Carrie, no, we don't need any prep. We're good. This will go great. Now Carrie's going, see what happens? Again, I'm so pleased to be here for a number of reasons, you know, and we'll get to the substance and we'll get to our reflections on that substance. But just the fact that we have this room and our virtual audience to talk about a profession that we've all interconnected with in some way, and myriad takeaways, I think, from Sue's opening remarks, but the one I'm going to hang on is, as much as we can, let's look forward from this moment. Dave will get into, kind of how we got here. And we do welcome your questions on that. But I'm really going to try to push us forward. What does this mean? And what does this portend? And how should we think about where we are and where we aren't in this competition? I also should say, too, I have a number of hats in my portfolio right now. Right now, I'm a proud visiting fellow of the Center for Strategic International Studies, joined by colleagues from and friends from various parts of the ecosystem that we're all a member of. I'll quickly go from my left across to give an introduction of each. And then I'm going to ask Dave to kind of set this conversation as one of the co-authors of the report, and then invite in the perspectives of my other colleagues. So Dave Gauthier, longtime professional in our industry, both in the Air Force and at NGA. I skipped over your nonprofit role in between, but Dave's seen this profession from many perspectives. And has actually seen this report from a couple of perspectives now. But Dave was obviously an energizing force in the idea to update our assessment of the commercial capabilities, but then a direct driver. And so Dave, thank you for that and for all that you've done to get us here today. And we'll come back to you in a minute to set the panel discussion. Nadine Alama is the executive director of the Taylor Geospatial Institute. The Institute is approaching its second anniversary now. It's a consortium, a research consortium of 8 institutions, 7 of them universities, and the Danforth Plant Science Center. And the overall idea of the Institute is to encourage and create and coordinate the next phase of the research that's required, quite frankly, to affect the next edition, if you will, of these kinds of assessments, pushing the edge of our science in a way that's meaningful to all of the important utilities that Sue spoke of. Jen Marcus, another good friend and colleague, and currently the executive director of the Taylor Geospatial Engine. You're getting a theme here. The engine is, if you will, the commercialization component next to the research output. So how do we get that promising research into our community, whether it's in direct service of our government, whether it's a partnership with an existing commercial entity, or standing up a new commercial entity? Jen's got a long history in our business from many of the commercial side of our business and some of the key players. And we're glad to have Jen on the stage as well. And then finally, Gary Duneau, another longtime colleague of mine at NGA. Gary held many executive positions at the agency. He was chief of analysis. He was chief of our international component out of London, so Europe and North America. And then he came back to run the other hat that the director wears, which is the GeoInt enterprise from the NGA perspective. When Gary retired, he went to Maxar and then moved from Maxar to USGIF and is now the executive vice president for strategic development. And in that capacity, Gary leads, if you will, the tradecraft side of the business. So that's the team. We've got some weighty expectations from our friend Sue, but I'm quite confident we'll deliver on them. But Dave, why don't you set the conditions for this conversation and give us a little background on the report itself.
Okay, thank you, Robert. And thank you to CSIS and Taylor Geospatial Initiative, Taylor's Engine, and USGIF as well, and everybody else who participated. And Madeline was also an integral part of the research team, so don't count yourself out there. This was a fantastic effort. One of the favorite quotes I've heard in the past is, if you don't know where you are, how do you know where to go? And one of the best examples of knowing where you are is getting some data about the reality of the situation, and that's what we had the opportunity to do with this report. It is my job to discuss the methodology up front, so bear with me while I do some of that. But this is a good story of technical leadership, economic opportunity, and great power competition. And we heard those themes from Sue, and I'm sure you'll hear more about them later today. I do want to talk about methods. So we had to select categories of performance on which to base this assessment. And so we took strong connection with the NOAA Commercial Remote Sensing Regulatory Authority and their benchmarks report of commercial remote sensing systems around the world. When you look at their categories of performance, and this is how they treat any applicant in the US coming for a license, they look at what is commercially available in the world. They also look at technical performance parameters across a number of remote sensing phenomena. And so we looked at their benchmarks and chose categories where there were sufficient participants to actually have a good competition, score the results and rank the outcomes. There are plenty of other categories, I would say, that are nascent and not yet fully developed in the marketplace, and we ignored those because it wasn't ready. You can imagine ultraviolet collectors, LiDAR collectors, non-Earth imagers. Those are all to be coming in the next rankings. So, but those events were not ready for prime time. Someone joked that you might call them the breakdancing of this report. So the categories we chose were in electro-optical, SAR imaging, hyperspectral, multispectral imaging, and also infrared. And to put a point on the infrared category, there aren't a lot of US companies engaged in infrared imaging today. Oh, we're not ready for that yet. And then,
It was a sneak peek.
yeah, sneak peek. So, but there are many companies around the world selling this information. And there are US companies, startups, and established companies bringing new capabilities, and they're just around the corner. So we wanted to really start and showcase the infrared for all the things it can do for our society, including environmental monitoring, wildfire detection, energy and agricultural use, et cetera. We focused entirely on open source research. So we had this team of researchers scouring the internet, in some cases finding spec sheets that were buried on company websites and in other places that evaluate these technical parameters, and use that. Now, believe it or not, there is information on the internet that is inconsistent and misleading.
I believe it.
Okay, good. All right. So we found that for sure. And in some cases, we encountered the first web page of a company and it's marketing material. It's aspirational. It is in some cases out of date. And we also joke that some of the marketing teams might be using performance enhancing drugs while they come up with their material. So we did our best to be the first line of defense, to dig deeper than the marketing material, to scour the internet, corroborate sources, validate information. If we had to, ask a company to volunteer something. But we did, I think, a fine job, and credit to the research team for digging really deep. We started in July, so we had an information cutoff date of July 1st. So if you were a company selling your remote sensing data commercially, and it was available on July 1st, you were eligible for the results. So that does put a few companies that launched capabilities this summer, some on Transporter 11 in August, those capabilities did not make the cutoff. And we'll talk about that a little bit. We had to define what nation a company would compete for. And you would think this would be easy, and it was not easy. So we searched for criteria that was as objective as possible in order to make these determinations. And we went with two criteria. Where you've registered your satellites with the United Nations, and where those satellites are licensed to operate as remote sensing systems. That cleaned up our results for almost every company in the world, with one major exception. And you'll hear on our second panel today from Satellogic, because this is truly a multinational company that registers its satellites in Uruguay, now has a license to operate them in the United States, is incorporated in the British Virgin Islands, and has heritage in almost every country in the world, probably, but is re-domiciling to the US. So they get dual citizenship for this report, and you'll see that in the rankings. SAR imaging has been growing in capability by leaps and bounds, and the war in Ukraine highlighted its efficacy in many ways. And through intense customer feedback cycles, the SAR companies improved their products quite rapidly. And I'm talking about long dwell and multi-look capabilities. It was difficult to get an objective truth on SAR performance. So we spent an inordinate amount of research time nailing that down, working with SAR experts around the community. I interviewed several noted SAR experts and learned the radar generalized image quality equation so that I could run that in my sleep. I'm confident, have done a very fair and balanced job at evaluating SAR. But that was also not an easy thing to do. The last thing I'll say here is there are some caveats for the results that I wanted to highlight. We had to choose categories. So we had to choose how we defined commercially available, what nations were eligible for these companies to compete for. We're happy to take feedback and improvement ideas from anyone in the audience, or sit down and go through the details. But the results landed where the results landed, given all the choices that we made. So up front, I'll say a major caveat is please don't overemphasize total medal counts. Total medal counts are an artifact of the research process. We could have discounted an entire category and changed the medal counts. We could have disallowed Satellogic from playing for the United States and changed the medal counts. We could have added other categories. The point is, we chose the 11 categories we chose, and then saw where the data landed, and we got the results we got. So, but we don't want to over-focus on total medal count because it's disingenuous to do so. So without further ado, I want to reveal the results. Please put up the results. So, the results, because it's a bit of an eye chart, show the 11 categories. In columns from your left to your right, you're looking at electro-optical imaging as a column, SAR imaging as a column, infrared imaging as a column, and spectral capabilities as a final column. There are a lot of factors that went into how to rank each category. There's a story in every box on this chart. I won't go into all of them, but just give you a couple, and then we'll talk about themes and takeaways and details and questions. In the upper left, the electro-optical imaging quality category. This is the imagery that everybody knows and loves, sees on the news nightly. And you can imagine that the United States has held a significant technical lead in this area for a very long time. And in 2021, there was a single company in the world that could offer 30-centimeter imagery, and that was Maxar and the WorldView 3 satellite. In 2024, 3 years later, there are 6 companies offering 30-centimeter imaging. So there's a grouping at 30 centimeters. The secondary factor we looked at in this category was how much daily collection capacity can you bring to bear at that resolution? And so the way it is to, July 1st, 2024, there's a 2-ball constellation called SuperView Neo 1 that can provide the most coverage at 30 centimeters. Then the French Pleiades constellation, and then all by itself, Maxar's WorldView 3 system, still pulling its weight, 10 years after launch, still on the podium. And we all know, and I'll say it out loud, that Maxar has recently launched the WorldView Legion constellation. And they're not yet selling the data operationally, so it does not fall in these results. But as you can see in our report, the Legion imagery is outstanding and would obviously put them on the podium. So I wanted to get that point out of the way. If you look at the radar column, SAR X-band, this is another interesting story. In 2021, there was a single US company, a small satellite provider, Capella, on the podium. And the conditions had just changed in the US in terms of relaxing the regulatory restrictions on commercial imaging. And so with that relaxation and policy change and sufficient and amazing amounts of private capital in the ecosystem, the US small sat SAR companies have done an incredible job at turning that into capability that you can buy today. Now the question is, where do we go from here? On the infrared category, I think I spoke to that. Not many US companies here. There are some waiting in the wings. Again, we can talk to that on the panel. And then in spectral was underrepresented a few years ago by the US, and nobody in the US was doing hyperspectral from space, and we now have a gold medal winner in orbital sidekick in the hyperspectral category. So that's a very broad brush overview on these results, but I wanted to leave plenty of time for our discussion. Thank you.
Great.
Yeah.
Thank you for that, for this, to the team who brought us to this point. On the admin side, I have a way to get questions on this iPad. Does the audience know how to do that, or those online?
Should be a QR code.
Okay. They can see it, and then.
Or they can submit online.
There you go. So if you do, please enter them there, and I'll get to them. But I've got a few openers, and because we rehearsed this so many times, you guys have no idea what's coming. But I'd really like to ask the first question more from a perspective of not your current job, or title or organization, but just you're all professionals. You've all been in and around this community. You've seen the different aspects of it. Just want to start with your top takeaway. I'll say from the chart, but you've obviously read the report as well. But to Sue's question, it's one thing to do the assessment. It's quite another thing to be up and do, right? What should be our broad takeaway? So, Gary, I'm going to start down with you. We'll come this direction, but just you as a professional interacting with it. What does this report speak to you, and what do you say with respect to perhaps our first step on the basis of this report?
Yeah, thanks. And thanks to CSIS for pulling this team together. USGS, really glad to be a part of the team. I'd say I'd focus on two areas, and they're areas that are reflective of my bias over 20 plus years of working across the enterprise under Robert and other leaders within the community, and with a real focus on interoperability and driving down data latency to the decision maker or warfighter. And I'd say those two areas are integration and partnerships. So I'll start with the partnership piece. When you look at the chart, I think we have to ask questions, not necessarily about the flags that are up there, those are gonna come naturally, but ask questions about the flags that aren't up there. Why aren't other countries' flags up there? Are they not worried about space as an area? Are they not worried about data as a weapon system? Are they not worried about the threat of other flags that are up there? Or are they dependent on other flags that are up there for their data? And what sort of dependencies, what are the risks of those dependencies of not investing in the remote sensing industry as a nation and other parts of the world? I've always been a strong proponent of our partnerships. I think it's what differentiates us from our global competitors. And I think there needs to be a little conversation about how our partners can help influence the results of this competition in our favor significantly, as opposed to being a pretty close call right now. On the integration front, and I'm speaking true integration here, it's about integration into workflows for analysts, for targeteers, for operators. I think we need to look at all of the tools that are available here, which are incredibly impressive, and ask, why are these tools in a different toolbox than the toolbox that is used for other missions and operations and capabilities? I think we need to have a conversation about if the answer is we need to get a specific piece of data to a specific person to make a decision or take an action, they need the opportunity to have the first credible piece of data available to them. And that sometimes will come from some of these capabilities, and sometimes it'll come from sovereign capabilities. But if we're not able to get either piece of data to them in the same way at the fastest amount of time, that's an issue for us. So I think we need to ask questions again about, how are the nations that are represented here integrating commercial capabilities into their normal operations? I have a theory, and it's a flawed theory, but when you look at China, their ecosystem from a GEOINT perspective is fairly homogeneous. There are flaws with that assessment, but in general, they're homogeneous. I know from experience and looking at the architecture that we've built with our partners over time, and for very good reasons, as Sue has suggested, from a risk management perspective, our ecosystem is very heterogeneous, and it causes delays sometimes in the type of data that needs to be provided at the right time to our warfighters and operators.
Thank you, Gary. Jen.
Thank you, Robert, and thank you, Carrie and CSIS for having us and doing this work. My first takeaway from that chart is really about the work that went into producing the chart. And I want to say one of the reasons I wanted to be a part of this was I was working at Planet when the chart came out in 2021. And my first question was, how did you get this information? So when I heard it was happening again, I really wanted to be a part of it to understand that. And I was blown away by the process that Dave led with the research team. I think we should let the research team raise their hands if they're here in the room. If you have any question about the future of our country, you should not worry. I was so impressed with this group of people under Dave's leadership in really digging for that objective truth that allowed this chart to be created. So that's my one takeaway from being a part of this, was just really, I'm really impressed with the rigor that the team used to pull this together. And my second takeaway is more of an interest in a discussion, because this brings up a lot of questions that I would love to talk more about, which is, why does commercial remote sensing global rankings matter? It feels like there's a kind of an intrinsic, we all kind of know why it matters, but I don't know that we all actually have the same reasoning. And it's a bit of a proxy for the way we show up as a country globally, but it's only one piece of that. And so I would like to have further discussions about what is the relevance of commercial remote sensing industry, both to our defense and intelligence community, but also to our country economically.
We'll hold that thought, because guess what we're going to finish with? Where do we go from here? Yeah. Nadine, your top level takeaway.
Yes, so now I have two categories, the chart and Sue, because I was like, I don't know, I was writing down the wisdom. So first of all, I know Carrie is sick of this already, but thank you for actually initiating this whole thing. Thank you, David, for your leadership, and Madeline for being the co-author, and Robert for being the glue. So I'm very excited to be here. I'm a geospatial geek. So I'm not a national security person, but as a geospatial, you're everything and everywhere, just like geospatial. And this, what you see here on the stage, is really our very first partnership at the Taylor Geospatial Institute. So it's very special in so many ways, so thank you. So I have maybe two observations, even though I wrote four. The first one is when I look at the chart, and this is, again, so as a geospatial person who started with Earth observations and NASA for climate and disaster response, and essentially, the sustainability of the Earth and of humans on the Earth, I feel sometimes that I'm always the naive one. How can we work better together? How can we collaborate? So when I look at this chart, I see the I won, and I would like us to actually look at it as, how do we work together? How do we work together? How do we work together? And it's on multiple, levels. It's the countries and the alliances, as Gary often reminds us of, but also on the technology front, right? So just being the leader in EO, but you have nothing else, is nothing. Eventually, any application is going to require a little bit of this and a little bit of that. So it's really that mix that gets me excited when I look at this chart. So that's point number one, is, partnerships, alliances, instead of, and Sue said it, competimates instead of competition. The second observation that I had was, she said something, she said, we have everything we need. And I wrote it down because I've been saying it recently. Like, we have everything we need. Let's get out of our own way, right? And I think this is the conversation about policies and the role of government. And by the way, the role of academia and the nonprofit sector and, industries and foundations. We're not working well together. We're not actually capitalizing on this unique moment, and Sue started with moment, this unique moment in time when everything is coming together, and we need to. So I definitely wrote that down. And from there on, my interest, and I think, the Taylor Geospatial Institute's interest is in what comes next. This is all great. This is level 0. What are we going to do with this? And I would love to hear eventually what sort of framework, right? David talked about the methodology for the capabilities of sensors. What's a framework that we can put together for analysis? And that's a question to you. And I'll be here taking notes.
And you'll be contributing to that future here in just a few minutes. Thanks, Nadine. Dave, I'm going to take the moderator's prerogative and say, you've already answered my question with your laydown. I'm going to give you a different question because not only is Dave the co-author of this report, but you have some experience here. You've been involved in this type of work before, and wonder if you could help compare and contrast your experience prior to this one. And I'd be most interested in the differences from your perspective.
Well, that's a challenge, but I'll give it a go. The prior work is retreating farther back into my brain
Okay.
every day, but it is, we intentionally picked 9 of the same categories. So there's some similarity from 3 years ago to today where you can extrapolate a trend. And one of the things I like to remind myself and others about this is it is a snapshot in time, but none of these companies or systems or nations are standing still, right? Everything has a velocity. Everything is moving up, down, left, right, popping into existence, dying out of existence. So the trends from last time to this time, I found quite interesting in the results. And if you pick up our bifold on I think on the back flap, you can see a little bit of a comparison between the last time to this time. In terms of process, this was, I could tell you in 2024, we had a very rigorous implementation of here are the parameters we're seeking, here are the formulas we're using to evaluate them, and it's been well documented and open source researched and cited. In the past, there might have been more artistic license to how it was done, but I'm very confident, and thank you, Jen, for your support in that the research this time is objective and repeatable. So
Great.
yeah.
I'm going to come back to the 3 representatives of the team that joined CSIS for this, and this time I want you to put your hats back on, so TGI, TGE, USGIF, and don't leap to the future just yet, but help our audience understand kind of your current capabilities at the Institute, Engine, and the Foundation, and where you see perhaps contributing as we go forward. Nadine?
Yes, so my current way of describing the Taylor Geospatial Institute, because it's a consortium of research and academic institutions with a lot of partnerships with industry and other nonprofits, is brains. We have brains that are always thinking about, how to push the limits on research. So, and I think that's what we are offering here. And I've been saying a lot that there's a gap between what our brains can do, right, the resources that we have, and actually us guiding them towards helping us solve some of the problems that we are facing or we know we're going to face. So I would bring the enthusiasm and the genius of a lot of researchers, and I'm hoping that we can use that energy to do the next level of, again, open, foundation, trusted, collaborative.
Great. And TGI is up for that.
Yes.
Of course.
Yeah.
With all your brains. Jen, the Engine?
At the Engine, we're focused on innovation. So innovation from the research world and thinking of ways that we can help enable taking new capabilities that are maybe research grade and getting them closer to being usable by industry. Anyone who knows me won't be surprised that where we focused on for the beginning of the Engine, and this is an organization that started from, it didn't exist to existence about 18 months ago. So we defined a program to look at how you could use AI with satellite imagery to extract global data layers. The first layer that we tackled is field boundaries, something that is global in nature and useful by a lot of different industries. So the way the Engine will contribute is in a couple of ways. To continue in this sort of capacity in providing research support to this kind of work, I think it's fascinating and important work, and the discussions to come out of it are extremely important. And also as a user of commercial imagery, and taking the latest in AI, cloud compute, open source, and trying to get the promise out of that imagery. I think back to what you used to talk about, the darkening skies. I met with somebody back in 2014 who was at Planet trying to get me to come work there and as a government liaison for the company. And they said, well, we're going to collect an image everywhere, every day. And I was like, what? The government wants that. And Planet didn't know. They weren't in that realm. So that's happened. That's here. We can do it. But the capabilities to do analytics on top of all of that imagery that's coming out of all of these capabilities is, again, like Sue said, the tools are there. We just need to make good use of them and good partnerships. So the engine will be involved both in supporting future research and discussions and also as a user and innovator on top of these capabilities.
Thanks, Jen. As I turn to Gary with his foundation hat on, reminder, by the way, well done. The questions are coming in. Gary, when you're done, I'm going to start throwing some jump balls up. So.
Okay, great. From a United States Geospatial Intelligence Foundation perspective, we're a 501c3 nonprofit chartered to educate the GEOIN community, which includes industry, academia, and government, on the challenges and capabilities that exist across the community and help facilitate conversations that result in action down the road. I want to distinguish between 501c3 and other nonprofits. We aren't an advocate for our industry members. We aren't here as a trade association. We are here literally to bring everybody together to help solve problems. And so I think that's a natural fit coming out of this work and with this report. It should generate a lot of questions that we've talked about today that you'll have for us, that we can bring the community together through our working groups or through our events like the GeoIN Symposium or other activities that we have, and to document some thought pieces that might lead to decisions by government and by industry both to help solve some of the challenges that are identified in the report.
Thank you, Gary. Okay, remember our dress rehearsals here. I'm going to throw out a question. All four can't answer, all right? Because then we'll never get to the other questions. So literally, I wish I had Jeopardy buzzers for you guys to come in. And if you don't buzz in, I will call on you. All right, we discussed the benefit of loosening restrictions, enabling more commercial entries into some of these categories. What other policy, I'll say revisions or updates, do you think we should be looked at in order to continue to enable the commercial market? So policy questions, opportunities. Buzzers aren't working. Jen, your hand is up. You were recognized.
I think it goes back to something Sue said, which is the way the U.S. government acquisition process is constructed does not align well with new capabilities, space-based capabilities coming online that are purely commercial, whereas they weren't designed on spec for the government. And so that process of trying to open up the acquisition process in a way that's supportive in the timeframes necessary for companies to be successful is a policy thing that I think should be addressed. You know, and matching up the timelines for private companies to gain investment with when the government would actually want something to be fully online, and making sure those policies are supportive of both needs.
I'll allow one more if anybody wants to, otherwise I've got the next jump ball. Nadine?
I'll say a quick thing that this is not unique to this conversation. Everywhere we go with geospatial, I was last week at the National State Geospatial Information Council, so at the state level, they're also talking about the policies of the government, in that case, working not so well towards industry, public-private partnerships, and not just information sharing, but data sharing, so that you can do the analytics. Back to your interoperability question. So I think when we talk about policy, eventually, maybe not to do it in silos, but there's a government-wide conversation on policy.
Indeed. I think this one's going to be fun. I'll summarize. because of the rules that you've, or the approach that the methodology laid out, right? Commercially available, accessible, swipe a credit card, you didn't say that, but I think you meant that, right? On July 1st, you're in. So with that in mind, the question is, why do the flags matter? It's open, it's available, it's game on. Okay?
I'll jump on
Dave,
that one.
Why the
Sure.
hell do the flags matter?
The flags matter for a number of reasons, but one is, well, I mean, first, I feel like we should be celebrating the technical achievements that are brought to bear by these nations through their companies, and how amazing it is how many countries are in space doing things in space and contributing.
In
But
other ways, it's cool to have many flags.
it's cool to have many flags. But then it matters that there be US flags for us and our community, because this is also a scorecard on our industrial base, the industrial base that's dragging us into the future of space capabilities. And if we can't hold up a mirror to our own industrial base and count score, then we don't know how we're doing. We don't know the velocity of who's advancing, who's retreating. And the last thing I'll say about this is, in remote sensing in particular, why I'm so passionate about it is those who can sense information about the Earth and the human activities on it can tell stories to the public and explain how the world is changing. And those stories are incredibly important for public opinion.
Okay, Jerry?
May I just quickly
Absolutely.
add, I think they matter not as much today, but in a different context, they'll matter a lot. What you're seeing represented today is a peacetime representation of current capabilities and where that data would flow and exist. If we were to enter a conflict with one of our global competitors, the dynamics of where that data would flow and who would have access to it would change, and it would represent an advantage or disadvantage to some of the flags that are represented there. So I think that's something we have to bear in mind. It's not just the environment we're living in today, but what those capabilities represent in different conditions.
Excellent. So fair warning, we're gonna do one more jump ball, and then we're gonna do next steps, your view of where should we go from here. And we will approximate our allotted time. So last jump ball. Oh boy, I gotta choose. They're all good. This panel, especially Dave, Jen, and Gary have a lot of experience in the national security side. Nadine, you came more from the civil side, right? And then your experience at the Open Geospatial Consortium have a different point of view. But the question is on technology adoption. And how or what could we do better in order to enable that adoption for the non-defense marketplace? I mean, Jen, you already allowed, or informed us about where the engine's going in early stages, but other thoughts about how we can, move from theory to application? And maybe Nadine, you can start, given your experience on that side.
Yeah, how much time do I have?
You have 2.5 minutes.
No, I think, that's been our mission at the Open Geospatial Consortium and now beyond, right? It's lowering the barrier. We need to lower the barrier for everybody to be able to use this data, which means using mainstream technologies or APIs, using the cloud, using standards for, the data formats or the APIs, open, whether it's open training models and open data and open science so that we can learn from each other and we can publish, containers of models and processes instead of here's the data and good luck to you. So it's just like, and we are doing all of that, lowering the barriers to entry, but there's still a lot of work that needs to be done.
Great. Any other quick comment, or we'll jump to the future? Gary?
One quick one. So people adopt technology, right? So exposing this at the earliest possible stage to students in middle school, high school, college. Will help people figure out different ways to use it and create technology we haven't even thought of yet.
Great. Okay, so this is the, how do we go forward? Right? One of the many challenges that Sue provided was look back just for a little second, check the methodology, check our research, fine, but let's go forward. And I would just love to hear what excites you about what's ahead of us. And you don't need to describe the next report in great detail because we don't know exactly what that's going to be, but how would you suggest we in the audience take this re-baselining, because that's what we have here, and then make the best use of the partnership that's in the room and online as we go forward. I like to give everyone an opportunity to go first. Jen, you haven't been able to go first now, so.
That's shocking, actually.
Well, I know, but there you go. I'm going to give you the first opportunity to describe what you hope to see as we move forward.
In terms of a version of this report?
I'm going to allow you to answer that yourself.
Okay.
Where would you hope we go next?
Okay.
Yeah.
I think where I hope we go next, it ties together with that last question about usability. And it would be really interesting to me if there were several case studies done that looked at the emergence of go back 10 years to now, the emergence of the number of space-based companies in the US, and kind of follow the evolution of the company and their success in commercial markets and in government markets, and look at what the blockers really are. Because if we could do that over 5 or 6 companies, then I think our policy discussion would be informed by some facts.
Mm-hmm.
So I'd like to see a Harvard Business Review sort of case study on a handful of companies.
If only we could find a think tank that might help us. Nadine, I'm going to go to you next. Gary, you're going to close us out.
Yeah, I think I'm going to build on usability. And I go back to my question to you. What sort of framework could we use to have a similar, if you found this useful, right, a similar way to simplify the usability and the analytics world that's, essentially bubbling up from availability of all this data? Is it the number of analytics companies? Is it the number of products? Is it the number of procurements? So what kind of framework? I'd like to see that report, and to me, that methodology being built in the open as well.
Great. Gary?
I love the idea of case studies. You'll hear a theme. I think it's where we go as a holistic look at the commercial remote sensing capability and how the data is flowing and how it's being used. One of the mistakes I think we've repeated a couple of times in the government is a lot of focus on the collector and not enough focus on the PED, especially from a resourcing perspective. I raised this concern when we started talking about the study initially. What you see here is collection capability, and that is necessary and vital to providing answers, but not all, right? So we need to follow the flow of the data down to the people who use it and make sure that they're getting it when they need it, how they need it, and where they need it.
Thank you. David?
Thank you. I'm going to suggest a two-step. The first step, before we get into the next version of this or the usability effort, would be to actually, I hope we pause and we learn from this work and discuss the lessons that it imparts and what it means for the future of, our society. And, we talk about this in the report. The governments are still the significant customer and purchaser of this type of data. So they have the most opportunity to impart change in where the industrial base goes from here. And so we would love to discuss issues around policy change, implementation reform, et cetera. I think you might hear about that later. And then, for the second step, what next could we reveal if if you don't know where you're going, if you don't know where you are, then let's find out where we are in terms of analytic services and the usability of the products that the geospatial community can create with these wonderful tools that we have assessed in our toolkit.
I agree. Thanks to each of you. I'm now going to take one more moderator prerogative and take my moderator hat off. I'll be a panelist and answer my own question. I love the idea, if you could put the chart back up, but envision it without the grid marks on it. Take them off. Take the big grid off around the edge of it as well. And frankly, take the metals off, no offense. Then I see both opportunity and risk. On the upside, right? What could we do if we, quote, cross the streams, right? We thought about, from the end in mind, what question do I have to have answers? What decision do I need to make? What time do I need to make it? Have that drive in across your electromagnetic spectrum and, find the multiple components that are going to get you to that answer in the time that Gary's operational customer needed it. Because, again, we're so lucky to have Sue set the tone and the tenor and the foundation for this discussion, and I so much resembled so many of her remarks about, I was in the industry, in the profession, in the top secret room when everything was a top secret image, except for Landsat, answering top secret questions with top secret answers. And it was a pretty good life, right? It was small, it was closed, but it was a pretty good life because I had things that no one else had, thanks to partners in the community that could create capability. But, the course of my career, which was quite long, though, I often experienced the fact that I found myself holding on to that the way it worked yesterday, kind of wishing for it to come back somehow. This chart, not that I think this room needed it, but it should be a wake-up call for us across the board, on both sides. The opportunity wake-up call, shame on us if we're not leveraging. And by the way, we had to stop at some level, so we, bronze is where we stopped at, but you know, and the research team knows, and Dave, you talked about it earlier too, how much of this chart came in just the last 2-3 years, right? The curve's going up. And I used someone's questions in here earlier and said, why do the flags matter? And I will say too, those China flags matter. We're in a competition. It's not a secret, okay? It's an open competition. And as any world competition shapes, competitors are going to use everything at their wherewithal to create their advantage. So we should take it also as a warning that this game is afoot, and it's more than a game, of course. And it's up to us, it's up to this room, it's up to those joining us online. So that's my challenge, both to myself, to my fellow panelists, and to you all as we go forward. With that, please join me in thanking my panelists for this outstanding conversation.
Welcome back to our report launch, the Gold Rush, the 2024 Commercial Remote Sensing Global Rankings. I'm Carrie Bingen. I'm the director of the Aerospace project here at the Center for Strategic and International Studies. And I'm really pleased in this second panel to have several of the medal winners joining us and getting their take on the issues that both Sue discussed and our first panel discussed. I will ask if you can put that QR code back up for folks in the audience, here in person, ask questions, grab that QR code. For folks online, there's a button on the event registration page. Please keep those questions coming in. There have been some excellent ones so far. So rather than me introduce each of our panelists, I'm going to have them introduce themselves, give us a bit of their background and the companies that they're at. But given Sue's point on, we're at a unique moment. There's a moment that we find ourselves in now. And now you've seen the results of this report. I want to ask each of you to talk about the moment that you find yourself and your company in, and then the top takeaway that you see from those report results. So I'm going to start here with Matt Turman and have you introduce yourself and your company.
Thank you very much. Thank you for having us, and yeah, it's an honor to be here today. So my name is Matt Tierman. I'm the president of Satellogic. I run our day-to-day operations from sales, product, manufacturing, across the board. Satellogic is a vertically integrated manufacturer of Earth observation satellites. We have our own constellation of 20-plus sub-meter satellites where we sell data and information to customers around the world. And then we also manufacture satellites and partner with nations and with friendly foreign allied companies to build out their own indigenous capabilities, which I think is a theme and takeaway that I have here today, maybe twofold. The first is, if there's no greater wake-up call to the U.S. and its allies, it's seeing the amount of Chinese flags up there on the medal list. I think it's a kudos and a pat on the back to, I think, a very thorough strategy by Xi and his government, starting with the Belt and Road Initiative to a very concerted, not a defense industrial base, but a whole of government industrial policy toward winning. And I think there's some definite notes that we here in the US and our allies can take from that. And as Satellogic, where we see the environment today is, as Dave mentioned before, we are taking the steps to become a US company. We are licensed with NOAA. We have a previous history of having investment from a Chinese company, Tencent. The world around us has changed markedly from where we were just 5 years ago. And adapting to that as a publicly traded company working in this space, just dynamics that we never would have anticipated. So it's a fascinating time, to say the least.
Great, Todd.
Hi, my name is Todd Master. I'm the Chief Operating Officer at Umbra. Umbra is a space technology company, vertically integrated, delivering the world's highest resolution commercial SAR satellites today. You'll hear a lot of similar things to what you heard from Satellogic in some respects, in that we see vertical integration as a key tenet of being able to deliver affordable technology. We are, to date, have been focused primarily on sales of data to our customers, but are expanding our sort of landscape now to both include systems to partners as well as actual space components, so like a full range of both missions, data, and hardware, all three. SAR, as a SAR provider, we are the newest one in the U.S., last to the U.S. market, I'll say. And in many cases, we believe that there is a first mover advantage, and sometimes there's an advantage to actually delivering the best capability, even if you're not first. So we have, SAR is unique in a lot of respects in that, new competitors in the electro-optical space, as that expands, have sort of a built-in basis of customers who are really familiar with the data, have been using it for a long time. There's, over a decade of geospatial data being used electro-optical. Commercial SAR is really new to the scene, and particularly new in the United States. So simultaneously, as we're delivering products which are very familiar to defense and intelligence customers, have to sort of build those markets simultaneously for the commercial marketplace. Defense and intelligence customers are used to paying very high prices through development of their own systems, and then in addition to like just a small number of data providers. commercial marketplace would like to pay next to nothing for that data. So it's a really interesting, segregated market between those two, and we're trying to serve both simultaneously. So that is why you see the differentiation in terms of not just data sales, but data systems also. A lot of sovereign foreign allies desire to have their own systems. We'll talk a little, I think, today about regulatory and how that's played into the SAR market and where the U.S. stands today. But foreign allies and partners do see some of the U.S. regulatory restrictions as a caution for them for using just commercial data, and in fact want their own systems as well. So a lot of really interesting dynamics there. You see that, I think, especially when we talk about China and its role there, and how they may look to proliferate their technology to countries friendly to their interests. I think it's interesting to talk about how that works with the U.S. and its partners and allies.
Right, Mark.
Great. Good afternoon. I'm Mark Mozina. I work for Planet, and thank you, Carrie, for having us here today. This is a wonderful conversation. Thank you to Dave for continuing the metal chart analysis. I think it is a wonderful tool to communicate publicly about the time that we're in. And so to your original question, so Planet is a remote sensing company. We've been around about 12 years with the largest constellation of Earth imaging satellites in the world, operate about 200 of them at any given time. We've launched over 500 of them. And our shtick is that we image the surface of the world, the Earth, every single day. And so we scan the entire haystack, and then we, with partners and in-house tools, we look for change, and then that helps inform where other higher resolution assets that either we control or others control should look points of interest to better understand that change. So I guess we're a bit of one of the early movers on this in the commercial remote sensing sector, and we also represent a new way of imaging the world, in that the focus is not just on how many points and how many collects you can have to look at specific objects, but it's really an understanding of the entire region, an understanding of the entire planet, and how that changed. We sell that data and those analytics to not only national security customers, but also to scientists like NASA, that was mentioned by Sue earlier, through the CSDA program, but also commercial companies like agriculture, insurance, and others. To your question earlier about where we are right now as a community, and I think we're going to dive into this later. As we look at this chart, and we do see a lot of red, I think the important part, not so much is on the categories and who has what metal and whatnot. It's more on the derivative, on the delta, on the change, on the slopes, on where this is going. If we were to do this, well, we did do this 3 years ago, but if we did this 3 years before that or 10 years before that, there'd be very different flags up there. And we're seeing the changes happening. And the investments, as was pointed out in your report, of 3 years ago led to where we are today, with the constellations up today. And if we don't make those investments today, then in 3 years, when you and Dave do this again, hopefully, I think we'll have a much more sobering picture. So I hope today's conversation would dive into that.
I also wanted to bring in an expert who's not representing a specific company, but who's been involved in these issues, frankly, for decades. So, Kevin.
Thanks, Carrie, and thanks to CSIS for inviting us, and Dave, again, keep up the good work on this. Kevin O'Connell, I guess, if I look at the data points on this, it actually goes back now over 3 decades. PDD 23, drafting from the intelligence community side, did about 10 years worth of market studies at RAND, including the famous transparency study that has borne out in Ukraine. Staff director of the NEMA Commission, was the member and the chairman of the NOAA Federal Advisory Committee for 12 years. And then, of course, my most recent stint as the director of the Office of Space Commerce, written extensively on this. I was reviewing some of the pieces I'd written recently. I wrote an op-ed in about 1998 that said remote sensing was a market, and boy, did the hate mail start to come in at that point. It said, well, it's only a government thing, Kevin, it's only a government thing. Well, it's still a market, but it's, and so delighted to be here. What I take away here today, a couple of things. Number one, as I said in my little teaser that I posted for this event, when you do this for 30 years, inevitably you hear about the untimely demise of this market segment. And in fact, that hasn't happened, as companies have brought in new phenomenology, brought in analytic tools, brought in new ways of dealing with customers. An early story at CIA, two guys showed up one day and said, you know, Kevin, this is such exciting space-based imagery that the farmer is going to have to buy it. And I said, hey, I'm from Brooklyn, New York. Have you ever met a farmer? And the answer, of course, was no. And of course, here, 3 decades later, we're starting to see expansion into verticals, such as Mark has mentioned. I think that's on the positive side. I think another way to think about this, those of you that know me say that I like to playfully, they know that I like to playfully say space is about economics, which in a space audience usually gets me some weird looks. This is very much a story about the kinds of things that are underemphasized in our thinking about space policy. It's about government advocacy, it's about regulation, it's about private finance, and it's about international competitiveness. And these are underattended in the way we think about space today. And so hopefully we'll be able to talk a little bit more about that as we go through the panel.
Well, and I fully plan to dive in exactly into that point, but one of the things I wanted to kick off here is, as we went through this project, what was surprising to me is when you look at all of these systems, and I would say when we went down this path, we did not think that we could do justice and tell the stories without identifying specific systems, specific countries. But when you look at all of these systems, roughly half of them that are on the podium were systems launched within the last 3 to 4 years. And I think that that just speaks to how dynamic this sector is right now. And you could go back, there's a logic here of there was an influx of capital in the 2020, 2021 timeframe. We're seeing the fruits of that. So I think really the question for you all is talk about the speed and the dynamicism that you're seeing in the sector right now. Is this a peak? Are we peaking now? Is there fragility here? And what does the next 3 years look like? Anyone want to jump on that?
I can talk about that a little bit because I think from our perspective in SAR, yes, to our point, 3 years ago we had 0 satellites in orbit. So, and now we are at the top of the chart. So I think you see those dynamics changing very quickly. The speed of innovation is enormous. I would anticipate if we came back here in 3 years that, the work we're putting in now, where we are on that chart now should be irrelevant from what, like it would no longer, we talked about worldview before on the chart saying 10 years longer, it's still in that spot. I do not believe that will be the case for SAR. Our aim is to make our current systems irrelevant by 3 years from now. So I do think you're going to see a lot of, at least in those new emerging fields where perhaps it's the first generation or the second generation of systems that have launched, I think you are going to see much faster development than we have seen in prior generations. And that's no small part due to, yes, the influx of capital, also massive expansion and availability of highly capable microelectronics that's coming from mobile phone industry, the auto industry. All those things are feeding straight into commercial space in really meaningful ways and being adopted by our industry.
Yeah, I can dive in as well. So we've been around 12 years, but in the last 6 months, we've launched 2 new constellations. So for our doves, which are what we're known for, we've been evolving them as they go. They're the ones that scan the whole planet. We launch about 60 to 80 of those a year to just maintain the constellation. But in just the last 6 months, we've launched a new constellation, one of which is called Tanager, which does hyperspectral, which we perhaps someday will be up there on your hyperspectral category. Focused on methane and GHGs, but also there's national security implications for hyperspectral as well. And then we launched our follow-on for high resolution capability, which we're calling Pelican. And so as those constellations build out, we will see new opportunities there. But it's worth pointing, those constellations and the size at which we will build them out will be dependent on the market signals that we receive and who sends us those market signals. So if in the lack of a market signal coming from one sector, then we will have to build out to the needs and shape our instruments to the market sectors that are sending those signals. So it's really important, since we're primarily talking about national security here, is that the national security sector work with the commercial sector and send out those signals, not what they want, not in terms of hardware, but what are the capabilities they're looking to have now and in the next few years, and think about us as an early partner rather than, okay, what do you have now that I can buy today, but rather this is where we want to shape to, and that helps us that we can move very quickly, but we need to, we can invest and develop into the areas that they actually have demand for in the coming years?
Just a great points by Mark there. Yeah, so I think a couple of things. So I think being a commercial company, having our own internal research and development, being able to move fast, being able to replace new systems, integrate new capabilities, that's a unique feature of the companies that you see up here, right? We can all iterate and put out next generation capabilities, and it's going to be a very different chart in 3 years' time. So I think to Todd's point, yeah, it'd be great to see just how irrelevant our Mark Vs are in 3 years with new capabilities. But I think picking up on what Mark said, the demand signal from the market is key. And it's not only the US market, we also have to realize too that the number of flags that we're going to see from the Middle East and Asia next time are going to be astounding. And that is not just going to happen indigenously within those countries. They're asking for support from companies like ours, from nations like the US, and from China. So it is going to be I was kind of tossed up before. I think the flags do matter in the demand signaling, but I kind of like Robert's point before. I think at some point it may not matter because the blending is going to be so great and the new capabilities and systems coming from different parts of the world are just going to be so ubiquitous.
So one of the phrases I've used in my last few congressional testimonies is that the space economy writ large is accelerating and diversifying. Now, don't mistake that for me saying that every company will win, because it won't. There'll be winners and losers, there'll be consolidation, there'll be M&A, all of the things you see in what is increasingly a normal market. One of the reasons I'm optimistic, and we should have the defense conversation again in other parts of this conversation, but one of the things I'm seeing is we're finally seeing that lower cost access to space is now bringing all of those non-traditional customers into the market. And so people that would never have experimented with satellite imagery, for example, historically, are now saying, gee, this is something I should take an investment of. There was a popular headline in this town a few years ago, all companies are space companies now, and we're actually starting to see different industrial sectors invest in these kinds of capabilities and many others, and that's going to create a whole new set of demands for this kind of sector. So I think in 3 years, you're going to see a very different set of charts as well.
Well, and I want to remind folks too of, it isn't about any one of those individual categories, but there's a broader issue here of what is at stake. Mm-hmm. What is at stake? And does it matter that the US isn't on the podium in, say, long-wave infrared? There may not be much of a market now. So can maybe, I'll start with Kevin and then maybe go to Mark here, is what is the bigger picture here that we need to be communicating?
So I think the first question we need to ask ourselves is, why are we in this position? I remember when you briefed this out 4 years ago, or 3 years ago, whatever, and a senior government official said, well, that's great, or at least we're keeping up with the Chinese. And I was fairly cranky about that to say, well, gee, there's probably a period of 25 years in which every single flag on this chart was an American flag, and so we should worry. But why are we where we're at? What are the sources of hesitation in the bureaucracy? I guarantee those debates are not taking place in Beijing as one data point, but what are the sources of concern? Regulation, hesitancy in the system, not being sure we want to leverage commercial on the government side. And so what's at stake here is essentially an understanding of what's going on the Earth. When we look at the Chinese Belt and Road Initiative, one of the dimensions is they like to go in and tell their clients that they'll describe for them what's actually happening on the strategic map of the world. That should scare the hell out of you, okay? And so not only that, but if I move to the commercial aspect of this, then I should worry a lot about someone that's moving in the commercial domain that's shown a great willingness to use anti-competitive behavior, unfair pricing, things like that. So there's even more of an emphasis by us to go as fast as we can to regain the lead in all of these areas.
In some of these areas, there are government capabilities. Mm-hmm. So why does it matter that there should be a competitive U.S. commercial capability?
Sure, I can.
Yeah.
So to answer that question first, why does it matter that it be commercial? Shareable. One reason. Commercial data is immediately shareable with our partner nations, and it can help shape global truth. So what is at stake? As China's capabilities or other adversaries' capabilities are growing, their ability to project their version of the truth in the world is growing. And if we look at Ukraine as an example, commercial imagery was being used the same day that it was being taken in the newspapers to shape the world's understanding in near real time what Russia was or was not doing. So February 14th, Putin says he's pulling troops out of Belarus. The very same day, there are commercial images in newspapers showing that a bridge was built that night, moving troops across the bridge to within a couple miles of the Ukraine border, and of course the invasion happened momentarily after. That truth, that projection of that power, that advances America's interests. Beyond just, can we do our national security job of protecting assets or making our assets more effective and understanding, it's the projection of this free and open and big D Democrat perspective of the world. To piggyback on something that Kevin said, analytics is missing from this. And if we look to the future, and Sue mentioned this as well in her remarks today, we're getting to the point of, and I'll use Planet as an example. When we started, we were a satellite company. Launched satellites, imaged the world. Then we became a data company. How do we manage all that data? Terabytes of data. How do we get that out in an effective way? And now we're transitioning to an analytics company. And I think there's a lot of people on the stage that share this. How do you not only have the data, but use the data in a meaningful way to make better decisions in near real time or as close to real time? And how do you fuse the data together to even better inform that? So as we're looking to the future, it's not just about who has the data, but who, just like AI, having a massive data set but not knowing how to mine it effectively is not that useful. But having incredible data with all the red, white, and blue up there, or our partner nations up there, and then being able to access it in a usable way, not only for the traditional users like NRO and GA, but maybe some groups that haven't been able to use it because they're not geospatial experts. They don't have PhDs in this. But if we can make the data accessible and usable, then they can help advance their missions no matter what field it's in. And we'll get more verticals that way outside of the national security sector, and we'll advance this global truth of what the world is actually going through.
Hey, Carrie, let me give you one simple answer. Why does it matter? Because it's the policy of the United States of America, okay? The one thing I disagree with from my colleagues here today is we don't need any new policy, okay? We have bipartisan policy that now dates back many administrations. The prevailing U.S. national space policy, the very first goal, is to encourage and incentivize the private sector, okay? We have SPD3 from the last administration. We have the Strategic Priorities Framework in this administration, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. On Capitol Hill, it's a bipartisan view that we should encourage the advancement of a strong, vibrant U.S. commercial space industry, including in this specific area. I mean, that's a broad policy. And so, not to oversimplify it, but that's one reason. When I look at a chart like this, and I'm tempted to avoid Dave's guidance not to do math on the flags, and when I look at a chart like this, I have to say, are we succeeding in that? It's not that we need policy, we need people to do what they have been asked to do. Agencies sometimes don't see themselves in the role of advancing a vibrant commercial space industry. And so it's the policy of the United States of America. This is a warning signal to us.
I'm going to actually jump on that because a lot of the discussion, and we all talk in some of the different trade association conferences and whatnot, is the discussion on, well, we just need a program of record, or the NRO, the NGA, they need to buy more. But there's a broader discussion here. And we can't expect the U.S. government to keep all of these companies afloat. Are we at a time now, though, where there needs to be this more strategic discussion? There needs to be an industrial policy. Yes, I'll say those words, but that there needs to be that kind of look at this sector when you see so many red flags.
I think it comes back to cost effectiveness is really a big part, and that is underpinning the use of commercial in a lot of those policies, is that there's an inherent understanding that if you're competitive in a commercial marketplace and you have to structure your business in a way such that it's afloat, that you are provided an inherently successful and cost-effective offering. And I think the challenge we have is that the way that we traditionally have done acquisition is the technologies have not been available, that we had to go do government development, and the few, or they haven't been adequate in the government's view for what was needed. And the fusing, I think we talked about you talked on the last panel, or they talked on the last panel a bit, of how do we actually look at what's in the marketplace and how do we look at our needs and we fuse those together rather than saying, yeah, it's still not quite the right answer. We're going to have to go develop our own thing anyway. And I think we're starting to see the pieces of that, I think, a little bit between Space Force and NRO and the way they're looking at programs going forward. But we're just getting started, I think, on that front, and I think there's a lot more opportunity there.
Just picking up on that, I think there are right signals, and as a company moving into the U.S. and supplying our data to partners to TAC SRT and the Luno program, like, yeah, it's all good, but like these are rounding errors, right? 10 billion over 10 years for EOCL, 290 million for Luno over 5 years. I mean, we don't, respectfully, like, there are policies, they're not being followed. We have a broken legislative system that is not working right now, that is not focusing, that is not directing the budget where it should go. That's an issue. But we do see glimmers, maybe not in our arena, but we see glimmers where this is working. There's a submarine industrial base fund that was just created that is now investing in shipyards in Alabama. There are unique mechanisms that are being put in place. Why shouldn't this be crafted for the space industry? Why shouldn't we be pushing on these types of efforts for our corner of this?
I'm gonna come back to you right now, Matt, because as I think Satellogic is a really interesting story.
Thank you.
And Dave talked about it in the past panel of, the one, in the Olympics, you have to play for some country, or I guess if you're Russia, it's the IOC flag or something. You were the one case where we really, we made an exception. And, we've written in past CSIS reports about Satellogic being very tied in with Chinese.
Sure.
So talk us through, like, what was that decision logic?
Yeah.
What was the evolutionary pathway to make yourselves, frankly, more competitive and to play for the American flag?
Yeah. Look, to be tied in with the Chinese, we had investment from Tencent. We never did business with the PRC or the government, just to kind of set the table on that. But as I said before, the world, even 5-6 years ago was a very different place from an investment, a market, and just the capabilities that were out there. And frankly, too, it was, for Satellogic being originally an Argentinian company with our manufacturing in Uruguay, BVI listed when we went public. Even I'm confused now, saying like, well, if I'm confused by that, how does an end customer view us, especially when the end customers, to be honest, are primarily defense and intelligence. And the way we saw it is, you could either, back in 2020, 2021, you had two choices, right? And you had to start making decisions. You could either go the path and align yourselves with China, or you had another path, and that was to align yourself with the US and NATO and other allied interests. And, for us, that was an absolute, no-brainer. But the decision to become a US company was just, I think, brought to the forefront, though, with the war in Ukraine, the fact that, we were supplying our data, our systems to US partners and US allies, making the full process and change to become a US company was very easy to do. But it still represents, for us, there are still challenges, regardless of whatever flag you bear, right? Because whether you are a Spanish company, UK or US, when you go into markets in South America and Africa and Asia, you're going up against Chinese when you're selling a system, when you're selling your data. And they are coming in and they're giving things away for free. It's wrapped under the Belt and Road Initiative. And as the newest US company up here, I can tell you, we are ill-equipped, right? We are ill-equipped with the ITAR regulations that these gentlemen face in their companies, and with the fact that we don't have an overarching strategy going into these markets, nor do we always have the full support of the US government behind us, whereas our Chinese competitors absolutely do.
Well, and Kevin, when I look at this chart, one of the things that stands out to me is really a lack of allies and partners on there. And this may be one area where the Olympics analogy breaks down a bit, is yes, we want to see a lot of US flags, but it's also tremendous to see a Finnish flag up there,
Sure.
a Spanish flag, and These are allies and partners that we work with, and in some cases, like with CSIS, they've established a US presence here. So, that's something that we should encourage. So what are some of the trends that you're seeing there, and how do you think about that?
So I think Matt hit on sort of one aspect of the paradox. We're the largest space market in the world by far, so people want to come to the United States. On the other hand, we have such complex regulations that sometimes companies actually leave and go the other way. And so you're telling a story of coming into the States. We have stories of people leaving and going the other way. On the international front, we certainly see that the world has grown so complex that we have made a matter of policy to essentially partner with our allies. And so we do want to see some modest capabilities for sure within our allies. Carrie, you and I have been talking a lot in Japan recently. The Japanese are living in a tough neighborhood and basically are going to have political commitment and funding for substantially greater capabilities, both on the civil side, but also on the national security side. So how do we think about those partnerships? Last point I'll make, and again, it touches on what Matt's talking about. One of the aspects we really need to think about is what I'll call comparative regulatory advantage. Because we're heading into a world where countries are realizing the value of having a space industry, and one way they will work to get it is by putting much more permissive rules in place. And so we have to be very careful that we don't put ourselves out of business by virtue of the regulatory environments that we have, holding companies back in areas like export control and others like that.
Well, and let's hit on that export control issue is exactly that. Is the policy says we want to be the partner of choice.
Right.
What's still holding us up? Because there have been some positive movements with some of the NOAA, like the SAR relief from a few years ago. So what are the barriers that still need to be overcome there? Mark, you were going to...
Go ahead, Mark.
Sure. So the NOAA regulation changes that happened under the last administration were a great step forward. They were a long time coming. They were a great step forward. They were a great step forward. Inadvertently, however, they set up a regime that permanently makes it difficult to lead because they're set up into a tiered category. And basically, very simplistically, if you are a novel, unique capability that is not commercially available internationally, then you will have heightened regulations and restrictions and pumping the brakes so that the intelligence community fully understands it, knows the impact of it, et cetera. In such a fast-moving market like this, the inadvertent the consequence of that is that we're perpetually waiting for France or Japan or somewhat China or someone to demonstrate a similar capability that we can then go to NOAA with and say, well, now there is a commercial comparable capability, and now we should be in a lower tiered category, and then all of a sudden now we can compete. So we're biting at the bit, held, once our competitor passes, released, held, released.
The metaphor I've often used is imagine you're in a race car and you're told to sit in the passenger seat till somebody else drives by. You can hop into the driver's seat and start your engines, okay? That's a basically reactive regulatory regime. Certainly in 2020, we got away from a lot of the time bombs and traps and things like that that made the process more efficient, but we still have a reactive system that we have to think about in terms of this competitiveness.
Yeah, no, that's a good way of thinking about it. Where I'd like to take this to is what it is, what that mindset is really a symptom of is a bigger issue, which is that we have not changed our paradigm of how we view commercial space within the U.S. government. We still are seeing commercial almost as a threat or a risk to publicly releasing things we don't want released or making available things that we don't want available. What that is missing is that this capability 15 years ago got a passport and left and traveled the world. So U.S. regulations no longer has the ability to keep the genie in the box. Pandora's box is open, the genie's out, everything's traveled, they've got lots of stamps in their passport, they're free. And so having regulations, and you also see this in how we contract within various U.S. agencies as well, is it's an older way, older mindset that we can actually control and shape the commercial market, what they can and cannot do, what they do and do not look at, how they do or do not see things, and that will make it a more comfortable place for our national security apparatus to live in. But what that's ignoring is all the other flags up there that are, with their first derivatives and second derivatives, flying past us. And I would advocate that it's much better for the U.S. national security to live in a world where it's U.S. companies working with the national security about this new paradigm, about this new way of living, so that we can learn to operate in the open and that we can learn to be safe with our national security concerns in a world where there is more transparency, rather than be surprised by it when all of a sudden it's released by a capability that the U.S. doesn't have, but that China does, or that someone else does.
Well, and I want to hit on SAR here too, because I think there is a good news story here in SAR, and this was hit on in the last panel, that because of some of those regulatory restrictions that were removed a few years ago, we now have U.S. companies that are, atop the technical performance podium. But are we good? What's still there? I mean, are there still ITAR issues that we have to tackle?
Yeah, I would say that there's two different sets of issues. So one is on the regulatory side. We did, in addition to, I 100% share the complaint about the benefit of the advancement in the regulatory environment, but then simultaneously the tiered environment automatically sets the U.S. for tied for first at best, but more likely second based on how things are going to work, which is not a place I think any American wants to see us, period. I think on the regulatory front, we did get even further relief. You initially, so the SAR licensing began previously, prior to 2019, 2020, did not exist at all. Began in the U.S., came with some specific restrictions in terms of, imaging modes, and all the licenses are proprietary for each company because they have to do with their distinct capabilities. But most of that was actually wiped fairly clean last year, such that we could use the full capabilities of our system, which is fantastic. But the sort of that's one satellite being used in one satellite imaging one place, and really a big way that we see a lot of the future is things in multi-statics, bi-statics, and thinking of, a collection system is not just one satellite, it is it's a compilation of a lot of systems together. And those parts, I would say, no, we're not confident that we have the regulatory environment that's going to allow us to really use our system to the maximum capability. So having more regulatory assurance does help build that sort of confidence that your market won't just be the United States government if they choose to buy it, but that you do have a global environment. On the ITAR front, it is much more complicated. We're certainly going to be, as export reform is sort of on the table right now, we're looking at export reform. The system that we could export today under the current guidelines would not be there would be no interest for that whatsoever. It would be a very low resolution system that would be irrelevant to most countries' interests. So if we wanted to go export to a foreign partner or ally, if I looked at the regulation as existed today, it needs significant reform to get there. So that does come to, again, this is where when we talk about partners and allies are great, but when you invest in a partner or ally, even if they're a NATO country or somebody else, they have the ability outside of the U.S. export control regime to proliferate to anywhere that they want, whereas the U.S. maintains that control within our system. So investment in the U.S. does allow sort of that is sort of your control of where does the U.S. technology go? How do we assure that it only goes to partners and allies in the places that we want it? The Chinese don't have those restrictions. European companies don't have those restrictions.
Well, and Kevin mentioned some of the Japan work that we've done. In that specific example, they are building out a sovereign remote sensing constellation. What a great opportunity for U.S. companies to partner with Japanese industry to fulfill that. And we do want to be that partner of choice.
It goes back to an earlier point that I brought up, which was demand signal. So and I do think Ukraine really helped to accelerate this, the value of commercial data was and other space assets, like space comms and such, was really demonstrated by the events in Ukraine. And so now what we're seeing is other countries like Japan and in Asia, but also in Europe and in the Middle East, sending out signals that they want either sovereign capabilities or they want commercial capabilities, and they want them soon and now. And so those are demand signals that we are receiving. And in the absence sometimes of clear demand signals from the U.S. government, then those are the ones that we will be designing to, if you think. So that's why it's so important for the US government to not be the only buyer. No one's asking for them to prop up an industry with no other buyer. But to be a buyer that sends strong demand signals to help shape us to be an effective commercial market that can compete internationally, but designed in a way that keeps the US interests close to heart. So as we build out those next.
Well, and Mark, I want to pick up on something you talked about earlier, which is integration. And I was privileged to participate in a Defense Science Board study recently on commercial space led by retired General Ellen Polakowski and Mandy Vaughn. And one of the things that they talked about is really, so long as commercial capabilities are treated as a bolt-on or a cost center and not fully integrated from requirements to acquisition operations, that community will be less inclined to leverage them. So I want to ask you to share some of your observations on those challenges and barriers from an integration perspective, but also best practices. What are things that you all have done in partnership with the government where they have figured out that integration, and that's maybe something to emulate at a broader scale?
Yeah. There have been a lot of challenges in getting our data available to users in the national security sector, and to get it available in a way that they can easily integrate it with other data sets on the classified side or with others, and how that can be done in a way that doesn't discourage users from wanting to do it. Because if that's too difficult, if they're on different systems, if it's not integrated in an effective way, then they won't typically go through the effort of seeing what they could do with the commercial data that's available to them. The other choice that we're seeing is, to your point, commercial data as being just an add-on, is that mindset does exist within some in the government, as there are programs that are, well, here are our national capabilities, and then we'll supplement them, complement them with commercial capabilities. But the budget is fixed and maxed, and then that's what it is. And so you give your operators a choice of, well, do you want it from a commercial source or from an NTM asset instead? Or if instead of giving them the flexibility to see what the new art of the possible is, it's this or what you're already used to. And that's an impossible choice, because one is what you're used to using, and one is how you're operating today, and it prevents you from being able to look towards the future and invest. Who's doing it right? Sue mentioned NASA earlier. I think NASA's Commercial Small-Sat Data Acquisition Program, CSDA, has a better approach. And their approach was one of, what is out there? What is the commercial market that's available? Bring in those capabilities to a small subset. Is there value after a trial period? Is there value in that data? If so, put them on contract and make it open for all scientists. So today, any scientist and any student has full access to our data, which cannot be said for any national security user in the world. So an undergrad has more access to our data today than any national security user, because of the approach that they took of, we're not going to tell you how to use it, or it's either this, or if you use this, you're not allowed to use other assets. It's open, it's available, and come up with new tools. And what we're seeing is an explosion of use cases. We're up to, with just our data alone, we're up to 3 scientific publications a day is coming out of us. And in areas that, like walrus migration patterns, we never would have considered walrus migration patterns. So it's beyond just the global warming or sea level rise or wildfires. It's use cases in the hundreds that we would never, and the way that happened is they removed the barriers, they opened the floodgates, they made it accessible, they didn't put a price tag on it, they didn't make the users choose this or another asset, and they didn't make them on systems that couldn't be integrated. Okay. And we need to find that in national security.
I have 2 more questions, and I've hit some of the audience questions, but I would encourage more to come in. So next question, I'm going to go to Kevin. Are we using all the tools in the toolkit? Are we using all the tools available to government, available to companies? I know you've had an interesting perch in some of your past jobs.
Yeah.
So what are those other tools?
You know my answer on this. I mean, what I worry about, and it relates centrally to this conversation, is that we know that NASA and DoD are in the space business. What my worry, and the first interview question I got when I interviewed for the Commerce job was, why the hell is the Commerce Department involved in space activities? And there was a good set of answers on that. But I worry that we have a whole part of the US government that's involved in economic and financial and investment decisions that's not in the space game. And so organizations like the Development Finance Corporation, the Trade and Development Agency, other agencies like that, we got the Exim Bank reauthorized. That was a bloodbath back in 2020, if I'm remembering correctly. And that's now a good news story, almost $10 billion worth of investments on the books. And so there's a whole piece of the government. If we think this is an economic competition at heart, we need all of the players in the United States government that are involved in economic activities involved. Similarly, we need a better set of relations between the government and the private finance community. You know, what I like to say is government funding and private finance are critical, but private finance actually winds up being an accelerant of innovation because it seeks risk, calculated risk, and differentiation between ideas. And so I still think there's a heck of a lot to be done on the economic side. And again, things I focused on earlier say there's a lot of pieces of this story that are underattended, that we're not paying as much attention to as we do the classical issues related to space. And so that's the short answer. If you want to talk more about that later, we can.
So we'll start here with Matt and we'll go down to, so if an investor were to read this report and come to us afterwards and say, okay, I want in, I'm going to put some money here. Other than Satellogic, of course, where would you encourage that investor to invest?
Wow, good question. First, they should set a little bit aside for Satellogic. Look, maybe in two areas, right? I think the first is while, yeah, 100% agree on the economic piece of this. I think we need to do more to encourage more frequent access to space and more competitive access to space out there. It is a monopoly. The cost may have come down, but it's expensive bringing our satellites to space. We need greater competition in actual launchers that work that are not a pipe dream. I would say that's number one. Number two, I would say, put more into emerging technologies that are not on that list up there, right? I think I would love to see, LiDAR from space technology next time. So that's where I would say.
Okay, and we can go back to putting the results back up.
Yeah, I think in some respects, obviously it would be invest number first, but besides that, I do think focusing on areas that have been underserved, that do have, to the point that I think came up in the last panel, maybe about missions that are not being done from space today that could be done from space, but haven't been economically feasible. Data was too expensive, area access wasn't good enough, resolution wasn't good enough. Very specifically, LiDAR is interesting. L-band SAR is a really interesting one. The US has no footprint in today that offers sort of a whole new perspective on precision agriculture, a bunch of other things. I think some of those areas, especially where there has been government interest, but not enough fund, it's always below the cut line. I think that is perhaps where you break the logjam with the government in terms of, it's not that you're competitive with them, but just they're interested in the data, it's below the line in terms of which generally falls for defense intelligence applications. So I think that those are the areas that I would encourage.
Okay, let me throw out a question here. Do you think consolidation in the remote sensing market is likely? If so, do you expect consolidation to happen among companies using the same sensor types or across different sensor types? Maybe Kevin, maybe I'll start with you.
It's a market. Obviously, if consolidation is warranted, and again, doesn't mean that everybody will succeed. It'll take place on a commercial basis. That's very different from the way it used to take place in the past. The government doesn't have to wind up dealing with assets. And so if it takes place, it will. But again, I'm more optimistic because I've seen this part of the industry change dynamically. Again, for years, we've heard about commoditization, we've heard about consolidation. Okay, we see entrepreneurs thinking ahead of the market in this specific market segment, saying, I'm going to be able to do something else. And again, I believe that we're going to see other industrial sectors now start to create new kinds of demands on the industry. So I don't want to predict whether there's consolidation or not. If it happens, it's because this has become more of a normal market where those things are natural to all parties.
Carrie, it's a little connected to your earlier question of where would we invest now. And I guess my answer would be a little different. I would invest in the analytics side. I would invest in the data side. Obviously, great data sources coming down, and they will continue to get better. But a real distinguisher is going to be which flag, which companies, which international entities can bring that data together in a usable way, in an understandable way, to make better decisions quicker than the adversaries, the competitors. And I see great value there from a commercial side as well as from a national security side.
And that also ties to another question here that I'll throw out, which is commercial remote sensing continues to be considered pilot programs, including within the intelligence community. How can we move to a program of record? How do we, and when we talk sometimes about, what can the government do, we tend to talk in generalities, do better requirements, fix the acquisition strategy, fix PPBE. I mean, those are elephants, right? So how do we, trying to channel my old government positions, like how do we take a bite of that elephant to get us down the right track, to get us to those program of records? What advice would you give?
I think to an earlier point about data integration, I don't think you're going to move to a program of record if the end user hasn't had experience with the data. I think even the pilot programs probably need improvements in terms of not so much a focus on the acquisition of the data, but a focus on, I think you heard usability come up a lot of times in the last panel. It's sort of like, I can have great data, but if it's not in the right system, accessible by the right, by the right people at the right time, it's worthless. Like it's not worth anything. And I think that a lot of the pilot programs to date have been very much focused on, here's a new technology, here's a new company, they've got this great data, let's buy some of that data, and not as much on the, how are we actually going to integrate that in the same way that we're integrating data from, national sensors or other tactical sensors or science sensors. Like that part just hasn't happened, and I think that probably that integration focus is probably a big piece of what's going to make it usable.
Okay. My last question here. So I'm going to ask a question from one of our bright young interns here at CSIS, Yanni Nikas, but I'm also going to use it to give you an opportunity to share any last thoughts. We'll close up, and then we have a reception here waiting for folks here in the audience. So as you look at this, what do you think is going to shake this up? What's that one thing that may shake this up when we do this again 2 to 3 years from now? And then any last thoughts you have?
Sure. I mentioned it before. I think you're going to see Indian flags. You're going to see more Indian flags. You're going to see UAE. You might even see Saudi. It is going to be a true, I think, Olympics next time. And that is just going to be the way, I think, the market dynamics evolve and change. We're seeing this now out there in these countries in the landscape. That is going to be, a fact. I think look, my summation of this, as a odd Uruguayan American flag hybrid here, which I love that flag. I think we should all take heart in the fact that, sure, we all wish there were more U.S. medals, less Chinese medals. We wish there were more European colleagues and companies up there. But let's be very honest. We have Canadian, we have Satellogics flavor, we have Spanish, we have Finnish. I think there is something to be proud of here, because what you're not seeing on the Chinese side, you are not seeing North Korean, you are not seeing Iranian, and you are not seeing Russian capabilities up there. We have, just as, the arsenal of democracy, which has kind of taken on a new cliche now, the arsenal of democracy was spurred on by our enablement of allies back in World War II. The same needs to happen here in this great power competition that we're in now.
I hate to give the basic answer of AI, because that's the easy answer to everything. But I do think, to that point, to Mark's point about analytics, I do think that does bring a fundamental potential shift to that, of the usability of that data. Once you start to actually fuse it, I don't really think there is any super meaningful commercial fusion of more than one phenomenology happening today. It's just everything is very tightly focused on this technology, and those address certain verticals. And so we haven't seen, to your question about consolidation, I think you're more likely to maybe see some of those things come together in a fusion fashion. And And your ML model that you're doing for optical data is completely irrelevant for that SAR data. It's probably completely irrelevant for your IR data. So I think that could really be the thing that changes the landscape here, is that once you see the benefit of combining those technologies together, that's when you're really going to unlock unique insights, and that might really change where you even bother drawing some of the lines on that chart.
Okay. Mark?
Yeah, I agree with both of you guys completely. I think there'll be a more diverse flag from the interests that are being shown today within our partner nations. But I also think there'll be an increase in Chinese flags. China is investing in a major way, and they have not slowed down. So if we're talking about derivatives again of change, I mean, they have much faster acceleration and velocity in a lot of these areas than us. And so I think they'll continue to rise and dominate the podium. And I do, as I've said before, and agree, analytics and making the data accessible and usable is going to be a major theme for the future.
Kevin?
So remote sensing has always been the jewel in the crown for the United States and its intelligence system and its national security system. If we want to regain the lead, we better be putting substantially larger amounts of funding and experimentation in this industry sector that we all helped encourage. There's still too much friction in the system. There's still too much temptation to compare private companies with what is effectively $2 billion or, you know, some large number of billions of dollars of investment. They're not competitors. They should be used in complementary ways. And again, the private sector, we've said many times, has speed, it thinks ahead of the market, and so a requirement system doesn't naturally line up with that. But let's take advantage of the best of both worlds as we try to move this all forward. And then lastly, as I said, you know, previously, I think there's a whole other piece of the U.S. government that could be involved here, not just because it's the right thing to do to satisfy U.S. policy, but it also becomes sort of a blunt for the Chinese Belt and Road Initiative. As we bring American companies overseas, that requires a lot of work under the hood on export controls, on licensing, and other kinds of regulation. But there is a positive path forward, but we have to actually move aggressively to do that.
Well, and that's so well said, because for me, and I guess I get the moderator prerogative here as well to close, is, you know, those really are the stakes. Is it's whoever leads in this area gets to set the narrative about what is happening on Earth, whether it be natural resources, competition, conflict. Something that we haven't talked about, we've skirted around here, but I do want to mention, because we dive into it in the report, it's the analogy of breakdancing. We talked a little bit about that, but you know, what's the breakdancing category? Who is that 14-year-old gymnast that, wow, you know, watch out for her in the next, or her or him in the next Olympics? So there was a lot of great work done research-wise, and this only reflects the top 3 in each category, but there are some incredible U.S. companies, others that are just below that waterline that you know, that's what gives me optimism, that I fully expect them to be vying in the next competition. But that's going to take incredible work by the government from a policy regulatory perspective, in concert with investment tools, including some of those tools, Kevin, that you mentioned, in concert with, you know, what the customers demand, and obviously, you know, these commercial companies, you all leading on the technology front. So I think there is optimism there, but there's still fragility, and it's going to take work to address that to keep U.S. companies on the podium. So with that, I want to thank everyone today for joining us. I want to thank our collaborators, the Taylor Geospatial Institute, Taylor Geospatial Engine, and USGIF. And then also just echo what Jen said earlier, is I want to shout out to our research team. We had a phenomenal group of researchers involved in this. So thank you, everyone. Thanks for joining us.